All right. This is life at its best right now. Bacon and eggs. Looking out over New Mexico. What could be better? Name, rank, serial number. Dan Milnor is my name. And I have no rank. Not even in my own household. I'm at the bottom, that's all I know. And I am creative evangelist for Blurb Books. And after 7 years as photographer at large for Blurb Books, and then the previous 27 years of my life I spent as a photographer. I was very fortunate because I started in photography when I did. I didn't know I was fortunate. None of us did. And I came up at during what I would call the tail end of the classic photo industry, where there were paths available for people like me. So I studied photojournalism, spent 4 years in school, got a degree, wanted to be a magazine photographer, wanted to be, a National Geographic guy or a Magnum photographer. And at the time, there were definite paths you could take. So you got a degree in photography, you got an internship at a newspaper, you interned and hopefully were good enough that they found a place for you on the staff at that paper or another paper. You worked at newspapers for years, you started freelancing on the side for editorial, and then eventually when you had enough clients and enough editorial, you could quit the paper and become an editorial photographer, and then that would last for a while, and then you would start freelancing commercial work on the side because commercial paid better, and that would allow you to cherry pick the editorial stories you wanted to do. And then eventually maybe you left editorial, you went commercial or advertising full time. That was sort of, and these were legitimate paths. There were routes, there were tons of photographers that had done it. The people that I was assisting for at the time were very helpful. Other photographers that would make introductions. You could go to New York and show your work and sort of get in line behind other people on these well-worn paths. And when digital arrived, it just erased all of that. It took it upside down. It turned the industry inside out. And a lot of times people think, that there was an upside and a downside to digital arrival. And one of the things that digital did was it revived a stagnant professional industry. And all of a sudden, people are thrilled. The industry's thrilled. There's something new. There's an immediacy. And at the same time, the public was getting low-end digital cameras, and they had a revival of interest in photography that was unparalleled since the time of the Kodak Brownie camera. So all of a sudden, there's all this life injected. But at the same time, it really obliterated the foundation of the professional world because standards and practices and budgets and sort of the idea of what photography meant changed dramatically. It went from historical, truthful, permanent to disposable, temporary, free, questionable. I remember standing in a news shop in Southern California and someone picking up the cover of Time magazine. It was a couple, and she picked up the cover of Time magazine and said to her husband across the store, "Oh my God, look at this." And he turned around and said, "Yeah, but how do you know it's even real?" I also saw clients refuse to pay for things shot digitally because it was too easy in their mind. So I saw a catalog photographer in Manhattan Beach who was one of the first people to buy a $30,000 DCS 560. But he's shooting catalog work, so his return, his ROI on this camera, he could pay it off in 6 weeks. It was paid for. And was the first photographer I ever saw that had a screening room for the client. So he was tethered, his camera was tethered, which was again like groundbreaking. Mm-hmm. And he was in one room in the studio shooting, and the clients were on a couch in the other room with a monitor, and they were seeing the shoot happen in real time. And I was like, wow, this is really cool. I never ever thought that there would be a dark side of that scenario. And he's shooting, and he does the shoot, and the client's sitting there, and I'm sitting there, and the client says, "Well, that was really easy." And he goes, "Yeah, it's easy because I have all this equipment, and I've been doing this forever, and I know my lighting, and I have good models and good hair and makeup." And the client said, "Well, I need you to do X, Y, and Z in addition." And he goes, "Fine, but that's a renegotiation." And they were like, "No, we're not. Why would we pay? I saw how easy that was. Why would we pay you any more?" And I was like, I literally went to my boss at Kodak that day and I said, if we don't get a handle on this and help people pitch what this technology is, it's going to go sideways in a heartbeat. And it went sideways immediately. And you just saw budgets drop and you saw timelines drop. But to me, the important part was how digital material was being consumed, how quickly and how trivially it was being consumed and disposed of. So I'd see fashion people or advertising people making images that I thought were kind of signature work that 2 weeks later people were like, whatever, I'm over it. And I think back to guys like Melvin Sokolsky and what he did in the fashion world. And if Sokolsky's work had been consumed like that, maybe it would never have had the relevance it had. Or if Salgado's Workers Project, or you go back through time of these projects that took years and years and years to produce, and then consequently years and years to produce after the work was created and packaged and exhibited and published and all that, and people are just like, I'm too busy, it's too fast. I quit photography for the first time in 1997. And I quit because I had done work so I'd gotten out of school in 92, I'd worked as a photographer for 5 years, and it was like in December of 1997 approximately, and I looked at my portfolio from that year, from assignments, and I was like, this isn't my work, this is somebody else's work, and it's not particularly good work. And in the back of my head, I was like, I don't even want to shoot this stuff. Like I'd get excited when I'd get a multi-day editorial assignment. And then at the end of it, I was like, I don't really have anything to show for it. And I had okay images. It wasn't like the clients were complaining, but inside I was like, I don't think this is what I'm supposed to be doing. So I quit and I got a job at Kodak. And this was so fortuitous in so many ways because the pressure was off of me to perform as a photographer. I sold all of my equipment, and I remember I traded a photographer. I had all Canon film cameras with zoom, Canon EOS 1s or whatever, and a 70-200 and a 20-35. And a photographer in San Diego who I knew said, I gotta have that Canon zoom lens. And I'm like, dude, there's a million of these on the market. Like, go get one. No, I gotta have your zoom lens, go to your zoom lens. So he drove up in a Typhoon from San Diego to Orange County and traded me an M6, Leica M6, and a 35 f2. And I said to him, I go, don't do this. This is a terrible deal for you. This lens is nothing special. Like, don't get rid of this Leica. And he did. And so I sold everything, and I had a Leica and a lens. And for 3 years, I only made my own pictures. And I did projects. I did stories. So I'd work for Kodak full time. And Kodak said, you can have all the film and chemistry you can use while you're as an employee. And I'm like, great. And so I just had unlimited amounts of Tri-X and TMZ, and I would do projects. And at the end of those 3 years, I was like, I finally know who I am as a photographer. And that was a breakthrough moment for me. I also simultaneously realized there was no market for my work in America. By that time, long-term black and white documentary work was not in fashion. People did not have, the brain was being rewired with the arrival of the internet, and long-form content was falling away. But I said, I can't go back in that treadmill of going and shooting work I don't want for a lot of clients who didn't understand what good photography was. And that's a point that I think a lot of younger photographers don't understand. A lot of clients, the people making decisions for clients about their visual style, don't have any background in it. And they don't know what good photography is. So they're used to looking at content, not photography. And content is the work that crosses your eyes but never connects with your brain because you've seen it millions of times. It's Instagram. Photography is what happens when you see something that sears itself into your brain and you can never forget it. And those are rare. It's Nick Ude's picture from Vietnam. It's Eddie Adams' picture from Vietnam. It's Larry Burroughs' pictures from Vietnam. Just as one small example, those are pictures that you can never forget. And that's not what modern photography culture is about. It's about content. When you're a photographer, you're in this sort of a tricky situation of being hired to do something, but then simultaneously needing to educate clients about what good photography is and why they would want it. Because sometimes even when presented with it, they don't want it. What they want is something they've already seen. And that's what you're seeing today is a copy of a copy of a copy. Someone has success with something, and a client will storyboard a concept based on what they've already seen having success. And then you're a derivative of what was already there. And they're like, I hope it goes viral, I hope it goes viral. And it's like, you'd be better off storyboarding something unique. And I think what I've learned over the years is that creating unique content is the only thing of value you have as a photographer. Because if you and I shoot the same stuff and a client comes to us and we're both on the same job or bidding on it, they're going to oftentimes go with the lower bid because they are like, well, they're basically the same kind of content. But if you make something that no one else can make, they go, we kind of have to go to that person and get it. And that's where the value comes in. And I think every generation of photography, worldwide, there are a handful of people who bring something new. That's it. And they're the transcendent revolutionary people. And every generation, someone comes along and you see something and you go, wow, I've never seen that before. I was certainly never one of those people. I think everything I've ever done in photography was derivative. And I would, even under the derivative category, I would say a distant derivative of. Like, I look at Eugene Smith and Salgado as in documentary people and go like, wow, those folks, what Eugene Smith did was remarkable. And yes, I am a black and white documentary photographer as well, but I've never done anything that had remotely the impact that anything Eugene Smith did. And same with Salgado. And I worked at Kodak while Salgado was working on some of these projects, and was able to see through one person at Kodak, who was sort of his conduit to the company, how he was envisioning these projects. And I'd never seen anything like that. Those people are rare. I don't see a new Sebastião Salgado coming along the way. That just the industry won't support somebody like that. And also globally, I don't think that humans consume work. He does these 10-year things where you're like, oh my God, this is impossible to ignore. And yet we ignore it for the most part. So the Kodak job allowed me into studios all over the United States and the world, basically. So as a Kodak rep, you would often get a relatively warm reception from studios. And Kodak gave me a laptop that had 50,000 photographer names in it and said, these are your customers. And I said, there are not 50,000 photographers that are my customers. I said, there's 500 in the Western US that we should know every single thing about. They are the trendsetters. They are the revolutionary people. These are the people. And they're across every genre. And a revolutionary wedding photographer is very different than a revolutionary advertising photographer or photojournalist. So one is not better than the other. They're just totally different. And so I whittled that database down to 500 names, and I knew every single thing about these people. I knew what they did, why they did it, how they did it, where they got it, what they paid for it, everything. And it was fascinating because it gave me a perspective on photography I would never have had otherwise. And I started to see cracks in the system. And I started to see, I remember going to one of the most successful automotive photographers in the world at the time. And I never once in my life had I thought about automotive photographers. I'm like, I love cars and trucks and stuff, but I never thought about photography of that. I didn't know that these guys were potentially the most financially successful photographers I'd ever seen. They had, Long Beach, California was a hotbed for automotive. There was a studio there that had 3 or 4 of the best automotive photographers in the world. They had fleets of vehicles with diamond plating, shooting setups. They were shooting every major American brand, international brands. They had studios in Detroit and Long Beach. If they were doing a shoot from Ford, they would go into their classic car collection and pick up the executive at LAX in a classic Ford. If Dodge was doing the shoot, they had classic Dodges. It was that kind of thing. My head was just peeled back. But one of these guys who took me a long time to get to know them, initially guards up with a lot of people, but then over time they realize you're kind of harmless and you're curious about why people are doing what they're doing. I walk into his studio, he kind of looks over his shoulders. He goes, hey, he goes, you want to see who I really am? And he opens up a desk drawer that's locked, and it's a portrait portfolio. And he goes, but I can't show that to anyone because that'll scare my clients to death. So that's like hidden until I'm done with my commercial life, and then I can actually be the photographer I want to be. And I was like, wow, that is, and this guy is super smart, very talented. If he wasn't a photographer, he'd be successful at whatever he was doing, but even he was sort of in the shadows with who he actually was. Photography and your mindset about what you were doing, those were intricately linked. Was the idea that everything you were doing in the field had to be printed in the darkroom. And what it did in the field was it made you razor focused in the field with things like exposure, quantity of images you were shooting, because you had to print those physically in the dark. That took forever, fiber paper, dry them overnight, mount them, mounting presses, the whole thing. And it just made you consider every single movement that you were making, which was great. And I am forever grateful for coming up in that time frame. Digital printing arrived. I loved it. I was all over it. My friend Paul and I were the first people I knew that had a desktop printer, and I was printing magazines in 1996 on a desktop printer, laminating them and using as my portfolio. The photo editor of the National Geographic wrote me a handwritten full-page letter and said, we've never seen a portfolio like this before. How did you do this? What is it? I was contacted, I sent all these portfolios to the clients I never thought would hire me. They all reached out and said, holy cow, what is this? Like, how did you create a portfolio like this? And that was based on frustration of looking at how people were consuming my work at the time and saying, they don't even know what they're looking at because they're not paying attention. I have to build my own magazine. And everyone said, oh, you're crazy, you're crazy. Print cut right through the noise. Print was like, these portfolios were a gold mine. It's what allowed me to start my career, is people were like, wow, this guy's doing something nobody else is doing. And they would fade within 2 weeks. They'd all turn magenta, even the laminated ones. Some of them got moldy. The prints would get mold all over them. So you had to like create them quickly and then get them in the mail immediately and hope they didn't get moldy in front of the person that you were sending them to. And so from that era on, print was it was always the full cycle of what I was doing, and it still is. I cannot imagine doing a project and not turning it into print, because print forces you to make decisions about the work that you don't in the digital space. And you have to pay for it. And that separates everybody. I have heard every single excuse humanly possible in the last 10 years from photographers about why they don't print. And they're all complete BS. They're all 100% BS. Because you can always convince yourself not to do something for whatever harebrained reason. You know, I should be on my bike right now. Well, it's cloudy, might rain later, I'm not going to ride. And that's kind of with printing, it always happens that way, where I did a YouTube film recently about the importance of print. And someone wrote me and said, you're an idiot. This is the digital age. No one cares about print. So I had to do another film that said, look, I totally understand that philosophy. And if you're an online photographer, that would make perfect sense to you. And there is a huge difference between the online photography world and the photo industry, the actual brick and mortar, earth-based photo industry. And oftentimes those two communities don't even intersect. They don't even know each other. So the guy who on YouTube, he says I'm an idiot for saying it's the digital age, doesn't even know that the photo industry exists. He doesn't know that, like, if you walk into a meeting in New York with a printed portfolio, it's considered in a different way than walking in with an iPad. Now, some people might prefer the iPad, but that printed book means that there were decisions made that oftentimes go beyond what was done on the iPad. I know when I review portfolios, I don't like it when I see people walking up with laptops and iPads. It just fills me with like, oh my God, there's going to be 500 images in this gallery. As opposed to the person who walks up with a box of prints, and I might not like that work at all, but when I say to them, why did you print these? There's an answer. Oh, I printed this because of this, this, and this. I chose this paper because of this, this, and this. It's the final opportunity for you to put your uniqueness on your story, is the way that it's printed and delivered. And it's so easy and so affordable now. I was telling somebody yesterday, you can get an 8-page, 5.25 by 8.25 Mad Cloud Digest for $1.20. And photographers make every excuse in the world why they don't want to do that. And I'm like, why would you not do that? Plus, it's a collaboration tool that's beyond imaginable, and no one's doing it, or very, 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 very few people are doing it. I mean, imagine if you're a photojournalist, and you're a hardcore photojournalist, and the vast majority of work that you're doing, let's say that it's even getting published. In my entire career, I never had a documentary story published the way that I wanted it to be published. Not once. It wasn't even remotely close. It was always, oh, we're going to give you 4 pages or 6 pages, and they would dumb it down and cut it down, and it would never tell the real story. And so I'm like, well, why wouldn't I just print a copy of a magazine that has the full story the way that I think it should be seen, so that in case someone asks, or an editor asks and says, what are you working on? Boom, here it is. And then they see the full picture. And yet photographers are like finding ways of not doing this. And so I always tell people, look, let's say that you have 10 photographer friends, and you say, look, we're having a theme. We're going to do a magazine on, New Mexico, and everybody submits. And then you've got this unbelievable, they have their core group of followers or clients. You have yours, and suddenly your work's in front of a solid group of people all over a $10 magazine. It's just remarkable. The possibilities of what you can do with this is endless. And I have case study after case study after case study that I'm constantly using when I do talks, which I have another coming up here in November, San Francisco. And I was with the founder of Blurb last night, and we were talking about this event in San Francisco. And I said, my entire presentation is case studies. It's just evidence. This is already being done by this person, and this is the result. And so there are no excuses anymore. It's either you do this, you take it by the reins, or you just go away. And print, to me, whether it's a tiny, inexpensive postcard, which is amazing, sending postcards in the mail is a blast. And when you send postcards today, the response is absolutely unbelievable. People just freak out when you send them stuff. I do letters every week. I do postcards every week. I write in a journal every day. And I have at least multiple, Blurb books or magazines or MagCloud stuff going all the time. Sometimes I use other companies. Sometimes I collaborate with other photographers on projects and they're based in other countries and they're using another print source. It doesn't matter to me if it's Blurb or MagCloud or Apple Books or, Asuka or any other publisher out there. I think photographers should be utilizing every single thing they can get their hands on. And I have a little theory about this. It involves a little bit of math, and I was definitely a consistent D- student in math my entire career. I'm mathematically illiterate, so these numbers might be a little off. But I realized something about 2 years into my Blurb tenure, and it was something based on something that Stephen Shore had done. And I saw something that Stephen Shore had done, and I had so much respect for why he did it and how he did it, and there was new technology presented to him. And here's a guy that's an incredibly accomplished photographer that's very important in the history of American color photography in particular. And a new technology was presented, and he did not draw a line in the sand and say, I'm never going to use that because my technique is here, and this is new and it must suck and I'm going to let it alone. He just was like, oh, that's cool, I'll experiment. And he did, and that ultimately turned into a book project for him. That's a remarkable book. And I looked at that, and it became a museum show, and it's in the collections and all kinds of things. And I was like, wow, that is the sort of mental identity we need, is to have, anytime something new comes as a photographer, you should look at it, understand it, test it, and move on. And if you incorporate it, great. If you don't incorporate it, no problem, you move on. I think 10% of all the creative world, 10% of the creatives make 100% of all the great work because they're fearless, they take chances, they fail on a regular basis, and they're not afraid, and they don't conform. They look and they see the world in a very unique way. The other 90% are all trying to be the 10%, but they never will because they don't know how to make their own original thought, and they copy everything they see. And so they're struggling, they want to be in that 10%, but they don't realize you can't copy what Stephen Shore's done. You can't copy Salgado. They've already done it. You have to come up with something that's original on your own. And to do that can be agonizing. Like I said, it took me 10 years of working every day as a photographer to even come close to determining who I was. And then I realized, and that was a wonderful realization and a terrifying realization, because I realized there was no market for who I was. But I didn't want to deny that any longer. That's all I wanted to do. And so when someone asks me today, are you a photographer? I say no, because I don't work as a photographer, I don't make my living. But I have 3 ongoing projects right now. And they're potentially some of the best stuff I've ever done that no one will ever see, and I don't care if anyone never sees it, because I have so much fun doing these projects. And that's the key, is to make work that when you're done with it, you turn around and say, this is mine. And this is important, or this fulfilled me in some specific way. I took a workshop here in Santa Fe in 1999 because Kodak got free slots at the workshops. And I thought that was a joke. So when my boss called me and said, hey, we have free slots at the workshops, you can go, we'll send you there for free. I was like, he's just like yanking me around. Turns out he wasn't joking. So I came out, took a workshop. The following year comes along, he comes back and says, you want to go take another one? And I said, no, I don't want to be a jerk and hog these. He goes, nobody else has signed up. So nobody in the company had signed up to take workshops. And I'm like, all right, I'll go back. And I took a black and white doc workshop, and there was another student in the class, and she looked at what I was doing and said, why are you not working as a photographer again? Long story short, she talked me into sort of quitting Kodak, going back to being a photographer into a different genre. And I did that, and I should have never done that. I should have never gone back. Even though that was the most successful 10 years of my life, that post going back, financially by far the most successful, I should have never done it. I should have just stayed outside of photography and done my own projects, and I would have had, my archive now would be much more meaningful than it is right now. However, I quit for real in 2010. It was Tuesday, I deleted my email account. I just was like, I'm done, on the spot, boom, my primary email address. And I was gonna move here full time, and we go back and forth because my wife was still living and working in California. I was gonna move here, change my career, try to get a job in the cycling industry or outdoor world or whatever, anything. And Blurb came along, and the founder of the company called me and said, I heard you're not working as a photographer anymore. You should consider working with us. And that, long story short, that's been by far the best 10 years of my creative life have been working for Blurb, because it's like the Kodak job on steroids. I get access to so many different kinds of people, and now it's designers, illustrators, publishers, artists, street artists, photographers, etc. And I've gotten a much better view of the creative industry in general. And I just realized how clueless I was my entire photographic career. Because to make it as a photographer, you've got to be so myopic often in terms of what you're doing. And you get so self-centered, especially in the social media arena or era where everybody is like tracking oh my God, are people like this? Do they like it? And all of a sudden you're in your own head all the time. So I'm out in the field for Blurb, and I'm realizing that there is this really sort of agitated vibe between the rest of the creative world and photography, because they look at photographers as too myopic, that they don't understand the creative space in general, they don't know their history, they don't know how the parts fit, how they interface with the Blurb platform. Photographers are often the most difficult group to work with, whereas designers and illustrators look at it and they go, I can find a use for that. But I realized something that was really helpful to me that I've been trying to instill on other people. If you introduce yourself as a photographer in 2019, soon to be 2020, it does not have the same impact it did when I was coming up, right? Photography at the time, when you said I'm a photographer and you had a press credential around your neck and you're driving around rural New Mexico, people would be like, oh my God, you're a photographer. You have a credential, you have been vetted to be doing what you're doing. And there was a respect level and an interest that immediately went away after digital came in, and people became suspicious immediately when the combination of the digital technology and the internet as a delivery mechanism. And so people would be suspicious. And I think what I realized a couple of years ago, traveling for Blurb, was that personally, I would not introduce myself as a photographer if I was in the creative space now. As a photographer, the important part to me is that you are a tiny part of a much greater industry called the creative industry in general. As a member of that, whether you like it or not, or you want it or not, you are given liberty by the public in general. Because, at least in the US, being creative is often taught out of people or threatened out of people. You know, you're a kid who loves art, and your dad goes, yeah, but that's a hobby, that's not a job. You know, you should be an investment banker, which is exactly what my dad said to me. And, you know, to my dad, it was photography's a hobby, there's nothing else. The creative stuff is just a distraction from the fact that you should be in business and be a businessman. I should have probably listened to him ultimately, but when you're in that creative space, you're not viewed the same way as a normal person. You're viewed as an artist, and that comes with power. It comes with an unbelievable amount of power that you have to understand, harness, and utilize. You can't abuse it, but you have to know that the public looks at you and says, you can do something I can't. You see the world in a way that I don't. That's the power of being a photographer. It's not the photography itself. It's the concept of having creative license. And it took me until, it was after I'd gone back to photography and I was working in Los Angeles, and a friend of mine was a private chef for some like A-list celebrity people, and she kept bugging me to do shoots with them, and I said, no, they make me nervous, I don't want to be around celebrities, and I don't like that whole scene when people are sort of catering to these folks in a really creepy kind of way. And she finally badgered me enough and said, you got to do this. And I said, okay. So I did this. I was going to do this shoot, and the day before, I was like, I don't know what to wear to this shoot. It's kind of unlike anything I've done, and I knew her well enough to. I called her and I was like, look, I'm kind of embarrassed, but you know what? And I said, I don't know what to wear, and she said, you never have to ask me that ever again, because they are terrified of you, because in their eyes, you're an artist. The power here is all with you, not with them. And I was like, oh, I never thought about it that way. And so instead of going in as sort of like, oh, I'm just the photographer, I'm here to do X, Y, and Z, and this person is wildly famous, it was, I'm in control because they want me for a reason. They want me because she vetted me because of my work that she'd seen that was my work, not other people's work. And the celebrity said, that's what we want that. And with that came the transfer of power to me. And I think that is, if you're not in control, you're always playing catch up. And in today's market, there's too many people playing catch up. You can't make it. And it's so frustrating to me to see talented people in a cycle that they can never get out of. And occasionally I see a young photographer who gives me hope for the future of photography, that I see and I go, oh, that person is doing it right. That person's able to make their own work, and they're financially successful, and they're making good stuff, and they're taking chances, and they're pioneering. And for every one of those, I probably run into 500 or 1,000 photographers that I look at and go, it's going to be really tough for you until you understand. I don't often review portfolios because I don't work as a photographer anymore, and I often kind of feel like it's not fair for someone to spend time with me because I'm going to probably give them some weird theory about photography that they're not going to want. And but someone asked me recently, and I liked this organization, and I said, okay. So I reviewed photographers for a few hours. I probably met with like 6 or 8 people. We're supposed to have 20 minutes at a time. And first of all, everyone that sat down in front of me, everyone except one, everyone had digital presentations, which I don't like because they're just not edited well enough. You know, it's too easy to leave too many images in an online gallery or electronic gallery. So one person had prints, and they'd sit down in front of me and immediately slide the laptop over and start, like, you know, arrowing through images. And I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. Tell me why you're sitting here. What ultimately, why are you here? And not a single person could answer the question. And I said, have you ever thought about what it means to be creative in society? No. Have you ever thought about what it means to be a photographer as a smaller part of this other industry and what it means to be? No. People were just baffled. They just sat there with their mouths open, and I don't mean that in a bad way. And then I would say, look, I don't want to be a jerk. If you want to look at work, let's look at work. And every single person said, I don't want to look at work. What are you talking about? And that to me, so the organizers came up afterwards and said, what are you saying to people? And I said, why? And they go, because people are coming over here and talking about your reviews as being so different. And I said, well, you know, I'm kind of looking around. There's a lot of photographers out there. There's a limited space. And, you know, I'm kind of seeing a lot of the same stuff recycled over and over and over again, and to a population that doesn't really seem to care. So we have to look at ourselves in a very different way if this is going to continue. And I think that to me was the evidence I needed, that my philosophy of what I gained simply by being in the field for Blurb over 10 years and going, I was thinking about it the other day. I've probably been to Europe like 15 times for Blurb, Canada, Australia multiple times, all over the US. I've done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lectures and talks and workshops and symposiums and panels and everything. I still don't consider myself like an expert on this stuff, but I take a lot of notes and I listen and I see patterns of what being creative means now. And I think if you look at the world and the culture and the sort of situation we find ourselves in, original thought is potentially what is going to save us if there's an ability to save us. You know, it's looking, we're living in, where you and I are sitting right now, we are in an extraction state, right? This is, extraction industry controls the state. It controls politics, law enforcement, everything. And so you can look at that and say, well, that sucks, you know, because the pollution levels coming from the extraction industry and fossil fuel and all that. But that's a tired story that people are entrenched. So if I'm a photographer, a documentary photographer, I can go to Little Texas down in the southeastern corner of New Mexico, where oil and gas and extraction has an unlimited, they can do anything they want. You know, frack it, doesn't matter. They're fracking Chaco Canyon, they're fracking the Black Place where O'Keeffe made much of her work. The public's asleep, distracted, doesn't care. So if I go do a basic photo project and try to make oil and gas and extraction industry look bad, all that does is entrench people even more. So the creative person says, okay, I need to do this in a different way. Straight photography may not be what works. Maybe as a creative member of society, you can go to the head of one of the oil and gas companies down there and say, hey, I spent my life as a photographer. I find what you're doing interesting, and I find that the opposition to what you're doing is also interesting. You should have coffee with me and somebody from the Sierra Club. Hey, you're a photographer in the middle, connecting dots in a way that people just don't do. And that to me is interesting. That's where you're not a photographer. You happen to use photography, but you are a creative member of society. That to me is the future. The days of like those stories getting traction and getting run outside of people preaching to the choir. You know, you have publications that run that kind of stuff all the time, and they do a beautiful job, and those pictures are often beautiful, but it doesn't go anywhere because the public's too entrenched. So that to me is the exciting future of creativity, is taking a step back and saying, oh, I'm a part of this big group of people behind me. I'm not on an island by myself in this little silo of photography. And that's what we need. As we need photographers as translators that are going to get information from one group to another in a unique way. Easier said than done.